Yeah, I was asked to talk about tribal sovereignty or share some information about tribal sovereignty. She Peter Dezu de third in share Tkachin Nishnero Kilachini Bashin Ashina Shichedo Toy Higli Nashinella. So some things to take into account when thinking or talking about tribal sovereignty. Um, there are many different facets of it. Tribal sovereignty is kind of tied to reservations, which are part of the United States. Um, each nation is organized into sovereign nations. So a lot of these treaties that we see that have been made historically with the U.S. government, sometimes I believe some of the treaties were made with the French and also the Spanish. So, however, because the United States did prevail, the treaties are with the United States. So, but anyways, sovereignty means that the Indian tribes of the United States have the right to organize for its common welfare and adopt an appropriate constitution or bylaws and ratify any amendments to the Constitution. So, for example, the Navajo Nation back in the 1920s, in order to deal with oil companies and sell some of the mineral rights, they created the Navajo Nation Council so that the federal government or organizations, oil companies or mineral extractors could create, I guess, business relationships for someone to sign off to the lands that are on the Navajo Nation. So that's one thing to consider. Let's see another thing: tribal sovereignty. Reservations are part of the United States. Each reservation is unique, and it just depends on the treaty and the responsibility that is laid out in it. But there is a trust responsibility inside each of those, I guess, treaty obligations. So another thing, the American government has a lot of authority over tribal affairs, and in previous videos I've mentioned that how the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Reclamation, Bureau of Land Management, a lot of these different governmental agencies do oversee the interests or the rights and the land rights of reservations. For example, um, I had interviewed a guy, Ryan Banal, and he talked about the Bears Ears National Monument, and he talked about the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of, well, actually, the national parks had some had put in place protections in place to protect the land that is held in trusts, which is very similar to reservations. So that's that part. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is the one that has oversees the dealings with Native people. I believe historically, Natives were under the Bureau, the War Department. We are wards of the state, and we were considered the we were considered what would it be called? Enemies of the United States. So luckily that changed, and now we're under the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So there were a couple of titles that were important. Title 25, subsection 475, or Title 25. It defines the organizations of Indian tribes. It states that they bequeaths power to tribal elders or the tribal councils. So that's a pretty important section of Code 25 USCA subsection 475. So if you're a lawyer, you probably understand that. But I always remember growing up hearing my dad talking about this code, which was created a lot of the ability for nations or the Navajo Nation to govern itself. Another important component of sovereignty. I actually read about this in Michael Lerma's book on Indian sovereignty and Guided by the Mountains. He talked about the Marshall Trilogy, built the basis is the basis of 25 USCA subsection 476, and he talks extensively in his book about the Marshall Trilogy. And I'll talk a little bit about it here in a bit. Just I forgot to mention this. I actually have I'm a history teacher as well, in addition to math and some of the other areas that I've studied and have researched extensively. In fact, my master's thesis is based on Indian self-determination, and my doctoral work is also based on Indian self-determination, or the Self-Determination Act of 1975. So I have quite a bit of research in these areas. So in this subsection 475, the rights, it talked about adoption. Native American tribes have the right to organize for its common welfare, may adopt an appropriate constitution and bylaws, and ratify any amendments of said constitution when. So there's two little areas that you have to take into account. It has to be ratified by a majority vote of the adult members of a tribe or tribes at a special election authorized and called by the Secretary, and that's the Secretary of the Interior. And it has to be approved by the Secretary pursuant to subsection D of this section. And I'll get to that here in just a bit. Subsection D under section A states that Secretary should call and hold an election within 180 days after the receipt of a tribal request for an election to ratify a proposed constitution. So this is just basically the law behind it. 90 days after the receipt of a tribal request for election to ratify an amendment to the Constitution and bylaws. Again, this is just constitutional amendments and subsections. So subsection F, privileges and immunities of Indian tribes and prohibition of new regulations. Native reservations have protection and immunity from departments or agencies of the United States disseminating any regulations, making any decisions or determinations in the tribe. So there are definitely some immunities. I know on the board at Navajo Agricultural Product Industries, we talk about sovereign immunity or waiving sovereign immunity rights. Again, other tribal entities, whenever they engage in contracts or business with entities off the reservation, they talk about waiving sovereign immunity. In a follow-up video, I'll try to talk about sovereign immunity a little bit more, because that's an important component to understanding sovereignty as well. So the Marshall Trilogy is named after the Chief Justice John Marshall. There were three important cases that impacted 25 U.S.C.A. subsection 476. And the first case was Johnson versus Mcintosh, and it was a dispute over ownership of land in what at the time was Illinois County. So this was an important case. If you want to get more research or understand that more, you can just Google Johnson versus Mcintosh or the Marshall Trilogy as well, and you can look up that information. Another case was Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, and this one Cherokee Nation argued they were a sovereign and a self-governing nation, hence the laws of Georgia did not apply to them. Again, that's one case that you can look a little bit more in depth on. Another one, the last one, was the Worcester versus Georgia, and this addressed whether the laws of the state of Georgia apply to the Cherokee lands. Again, these are considered the Marshall Trilogy. These are three cases that are cited extensively, so that's something that you can probably look at. So there are some sovereignty issues as well, whether tribes should be seen as completely sovereign nations. They are, in a sense, like, we talk about government to government relations. They are on some aspects, but on some aspects, we really aren't sovereign, because if we are thought of as wards of the state, or as we're underneath the government, it's not necessarily government to government, because if you look at, we don't necessarily, our nations, we say, in theory, we say we're sovereigns, but if we have to get approval from the federal government to enter into a contract with I don't know, for example, years ago, the Navajo Napi, which is the Navajo Nation farm, entered into a contract with Cuba and sold pinto beans to Cuba. They had to bypass, like, the Department of Agriculture and bypass some of the tariffs in order to sell export pinto beans to Cuba. But that's what I mean. Like, we talk about sovereignty and self-determination, But if we have to get approval from the federal government or the Bureau of Indian Affairs or Bureau of Reclamation or Bureau of Land Management, we're not necessarily sovereign. It's in theory, I guess you could say. Um, but whenever you look at it, complete sovereignty means that Native Indian reservations have the power to make their own decisions exclusively through their tribal elders or tribal councils. Um, like I said, that would be nice, but there are some things that we do have to have to consult the federal government. I mean, we like to say that it is, but I mean, there are some instances in history where it that is not the case. Um, for example, I'll use Navajo. I'll use Napi as an example. So in the late 1960s and 1970s, there the Chama diversion, which was above Pagosa Springs or Wolf Creek Pass in Colorado. Their water was diverted down the Rio Grande Valley. In exchange for those water rights, the Napi Farm and the diversion um, was created, and there's extensive 70 or 80 miles of canals and siphons that were constructed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Bureau of Interior as well, and to create this farm up that's south of Farmington or where I live. But the thing is that was created in exchange. But the thing is, like there are some issues that we are facing right now that a lot of the maintenance is not taken care of, and there's some issues right there. The federal government has not completed the completion of the entire project. It's supposed to be 110,000 acres, but currently we're only at about 72,000 acres. So that again, there's one that Chama diversion where the water's being taken, and that was completed for the residents of the Rio Grande Valley, but the Navajo Nation, the farm was not completed. So that's what I mean. Like in theory, it's nice, but when it comes down to it, that's the federal government is there, and they prevent a lot of Native nations from engaging in governing and making decisions on their own. And again, do not true sovereignty means they do not answer to the American government or their Bureau of Indian Affairs. But that's what we say, true sovereignty in theory, and I keep mentioning that. In theory, it is, and we say we do it. Okay, so again, most tribes want to be completely sovereign as a result of the American government, the atrocities the American government um, made against the American Indians, right? Uh, Also, you have to take into account all of the relocation acts against the civilized tribes. The American government rarely upheld their end on treaties. I mean, we always hear about broken treaty rights. I just gave an example of the Chama diversion that wasn't completed, and that's just been in the last 50 years. I mean, native communities, you hear about all of these issues on Indian country holding the federal government up to their treaty responsibilities, especially in education. That's one component where people are constantly talking about the treaty responsibilities. And IHS is another big concern, funding it, especially most recently that I can think of was whenever the government shut down. A lot of bureau workers were put on furlough. That impacted New Mexico. I think they were saying 60 or 70% of jobs in New Mexico were bureau or government jobs. So that kind of gives you perspective on these issues. So again, government orchestrated atrocities to take land, to take resources. It's gone on for hundreds of years. There's so many different instances where the federal government has not upheld their responsibility, and it's like you know it's like my kids. If I'm not taking care of them, and telling them no, things, they're going to start to get upset. So like if we're thought of as wards of the state, that's why we talk about, well, you have a responsibility to take care of us. That's a pretty important component of some of the responsibilities. But if you look at that, like, if it's adult to adults, that's true sovereign, right? But adult and we're a ward underneath the federal government, it's not true sovereignty. Okay, so that's just to differentiate that and to make that analogy a little bit more close to home about sovereignty, kind of on a family level. Hopefully, that kind of puts some things into perspective as far as sovereignty. Um, Also, there was a bunch of relocation acts, Indian Removal Act, which was signed by, I believe, Andrew Jackson. It transpired during, oh my gosh, what was his name? President Van Buren's presidency, and that's one of the, I believe, probably one of the worst presidents for indigenous people. Trail of Tears, and where many native nations and many indigenous people had to relocate to different areas of the United States. In fact, the Navajo also had to relocate. They were herded up like sheep and cattle, and I guess marched to Fort Sumner, which is, I believe, it was 300 or 400 miles south east of where the current reservation is, and just put on barren land where nothing can be grown. The soil was very salty, and nothing can grow on that land down there. If you look at it to this day and age. So lack of respect for treaties, that's a big component of lack of respect in general, because if they're not respecting that we are sovereign nations and the way the treaties and were written, it is. Whenever you're in war and you create a treaty with someone, that you're thought as equals, but that's not the case. So some of the things that to take into account as well is, opposition to complete sovereignty. If native nations were sovereign, there would be tiny sovereign states inside America's states. In fact, I read a paper that my wife wrote recently, and she was talking about being a dual citizen, which most native people are. We are citizens within our nations, whatever individual tribe we are associated with. Like, for example, we're Navajo, so we're Navajo, and we have certificates of Indian blood. Some people have a blood quantum, so they have dual citizenship, where they can vote in their tribal elections, and also we vote in the federal elections as well for president or state and congressional seats as well. Some tribes lack the ability to sustain themselves. I know natives always talk about commods or commodity food. That is food that is supplied by the federal government to make up for those lack of resources. And I know the tribe, I guess, made native people dependent on those resources. We talk about government housing. We talk about, let's see, what are some other, like government parks, federal parks on Indian lands, the resources. So, if you lack sustainability, then that's where the government steps in and takes care. Our healthcare system, Indian Health Services, things like that. So the federal government and the Bureau of Indian Affairs would no longer be there to protect and manage native nations. So, for example, an Eastern agency on the Navajo Nation, they call it the Checkerboard Region. So years ago, land was given to individual Navajos. However, some of these Navajos, because of lack of resources, which was a comment I made earlier, that they ended up selling their land to private citizens. And because of that, if you look at Eastern Navajo Nation, that's why they call it checkerboard region, because square plots or quadrilateral plots were sold off in return for funds, sometimes for like pennies on the dollar, or like for alcohol. So you hear stories of that where non-indigenous or settlers or colonizers took advantage of native nations. So those are some things to take into account. Again, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the United States Constitution, in there it's stated the United States Congress shall have power to regulate commerce to foreign nations and with Indian tribes. So they do have that power to regulate. Again, within that language, like they have the power over native nations. So it's kind of contradictory to hear that we are sovereign, but we're not sovereign. Okay, so keep that in mind. If reservations were sovereign, the United States Constitution power over the reservations and powers bequeathed from the Constitution therein would no longer exist. So again, we look at that and we try to analyze that. And when you do analyze it, that's where a lot of times Native people say, we are sovereign nations, and this is what is written in the Constitution. We are trying to hold the federal government accountable for treaties and some of these uh, I guess, what do they call them? Presidential. I can't think of the name right now. Executive orders that the president and previous presidents have put into place. So those are the things that we have to manage and look at and take a look at the law. And that's why a lot of our upcoming Navajo lawyers are understanding how to interpret that federal law and the Constitution, which is actually one of the reasons why a lot of Native nations are starting to be more in control of their own affairs, because being able to interpret the law is a part of the process. If you don't understand the law, then a lot of times the government and governmental agencies take advantage of the common people. So that's important to understand as well. Let's see. Trying to think of other topics around sovereignty. So so the federal government of Bureau of Indian Affairs would no longer be there to protect and manage native reservations. For example, the Department of Interior, I think they're called Bureau. I keep thinking of the movie with Val Kilmer, where they go onto the Standing Rock Reservation whenever whenever people were getting killed. It was a movie, but that's pretty common. Like even here in Farmington, if there's a crime out on the reservation, the FBI, that's it. The FBI go in and do an investigation as well. Although there are some tribes that do have their tribal police, like the Navajo Nation and other tribes. I know the Southern Ute and the Sky-Ute also have their own tribal police. I think a lot of Native nations have their own tribal police. In fact, some Indian tribes see the federal government as their guardian, and I talked about this, ward of the state, guardian, and rely on the federal government for their protection, although this does not impede the right to self-governance. It's just, whenever there's not a lot of resources available, the federal government has to step in and help us out. But I mean, if you look at that, if we talk about true sovereign, the Bureau of Indian Affairs will have to be eliminated, because if you look at it, like the United States was in war with Japan, and we don't have any, I guess, government offices, Bureau of Japanese Affairs offices in Japan, trying to control and regulate their commerce as well. So that's a way to look at it, if that makes any sense at all. But I mean, there's so many different components of sovereignty to understand what's going on and how it impacts Native people individually. I know in a couple of other videos I talk about this issue of sovereignty and how to navigate those processes and those structures that are in place. And you look at it. For example, I went to go look at the Bosque Redondo, in Navajo we call it. Oh my gosh, what was it called now? No, so Sani, the treaty of 1868. Like you look at it, and you can't really tell if our people understood the components of that treaty. But then you look at it, and if your people are starving and they're under duress, and they sign that for survival, some of those components, they weren't really necessarily negotiated because of the position that we were in. And I think that's that compromising position that the federal government placed a lot of tribal nations into, where they did end up having to sign no matter what. So that's another important thing to talk about. But other than that, I mean, I know I keep saying this. I think I've said this several times, that it's such a complex phenomena that exists, that a lot of Native people and a lot of Native researchers and lawyers are starting to study this, to be more knowledgeable about how to navigate the Constitution, the different laws that are in place. And the other thing too is, I run a podcast, and some of these issues come out, as far as red tape, as far as business development. I know I spoke with I think one of the candidates for president, Kelvin Lee Jr., and he talked about he's a lawyer for uranium and oil mineral rights and stuff like that, and I'm sure he has a lot more understanding of how sovereignty impacts Native nations, and he talked about some of the cases that he's defended or prosecuted, depending on which side of the law he was on. But those are the conversations that need to be discussed, and people need to be educated, and I think that's one of the responsibilities for up and coming leaders to talk about, communicate and make the language so everybody can understand. So I don't know, if you have any questions, feel free to message or comment in the video box below, and I'll definitely try to upload this video to my podcast as well. But I've had some people ask me about sovereignty and what it means. I did a presentation a couple of weeks ago about sovereignty and the impact it has on Navajo people. But I mean, that's just one tribe out of 580 plus Native nations, and treaties were signed with many of these nations and the federal government. Again, I had mentioned Michael Lerma in his book Guided by the Mountains, and he talks about some of these different components that have impacted our people today. So if you have any questions, feel free to message me and pose a question. I don't mind talking about some of these issues and educating people on it. I mean, I'm an educator, and I think that's one of the reasons why I like to talk about these issues, because who else is going to do it? I didn't find very many videos on YouTube that talk about tribal sovereignty and explain what sovereignty is. Again, but just keep in mind though, if you need a more detailed explanation of the Marshall Trilogy, you can Google that. And I don't know, I didn't even see any videos on the Marshall Trilogy, so maybe someone can create that. And I know in research, people always talk about that there's a lack of research for Native studies, Native law, Native economic development, things of that nature. So I guess this is one of those areas where if there's no videos, I was like, well, might as well just make one. But if someone out there can make a video on the Marshall Trilogy and explain it, probably from a legal perspective, but in layman terms or in common terms, that would probably be beneficial as well. So anyway, that's it. That's my perspective on sovereignty, and that is my perspective, the way I understand it and the way I've seen sovereignty talked about. Like I said, I was growing up, and I always heard my dad talking about sovereignty, Navajo sovereignty, and I believe in Navajo it's called Naselid, which is the rainbow around the Navajo Nation flag, or the Great Seal as well. So the rainbow, Naselid. So hopefully you have a good day. Like my video and follow my page. Have a good one. Again, this is Peter Deswood. Going now.